and enjoy the panel.
Very nice. Thank you, Katie. Thanks everybody for coming out. Really excited about this panel and excited to see where the conversation goes. As Katie said, my name is Brad McNamara. I'm best known here for co-founding Freight Farms, modular hydroponic farms inside of shipping containers. Was able to build prototypes in a parking lot with everything you could find at Home Depot and in my basement, all the way through a network of farms in, I think we're now in like 30 countries and almost 50 states in the US. So cranking out farms like crazy. And it's interesting when you build a product that I used to joke, when we were pitching for venture capital, sorry, I didn't bring my product in here. It weighs 8,000 pounds. It doesn't exactly fit in a boardroom. So that was always a fun one. If it landed, I knew I had a good audience. If it didn't, that pitch didn't go well. So yeah, I mean, really going to have a great conversation, somewhat open-ended, but going to want to direct it to what you guys think is important. So any questions or thoughts you have, drop them in the chat and we'll definitely try to get to them. Really excited to have Anya, Brian, and Peter here to share their expertise, their knowledge, and maybe a few anecdotes to help anybody along their way, either find the next step, get unstuck, or ideally avoid a pothole that you might not see in the road coming down that we've maybe stepped in and twisted an ankle a time or two. So happy to share all those. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves briefly, and then we can get right into it. I guess we can go alphabetically. Anya, if you want to just give your intro.
Sure, thanks, Brad. So my name is Anya Losick, and I'm the program manager at Forge, which is a nonprofit organization based in Somerville, Massachusetts. We are actually the sister organization of Greentown Labs. If any of you are familiar with that, it is North America's largest climate tech startup incubator. And we are an organization focused on manufacturing readiness and supply chain referrals for innovators. I'm actually a Northeastern alum myself. I graduated from the College of Science last year, and I spent some time in the innovation and the startup ecosystem during my co-ops, which is how I landed in this role. So as program manager, I spend most of my time talking to founders, CEOs, and other technical leads at startups about their product development process. I've actually met with close to 200 startups since I started in this role last year, one of which being Freight Farms, a la Brad, and a couple other familiar faces on this call I see. So we really work to help accelerate startups with physical prototypes on their path to commercialization and impact at scale. And we do this through harnessing a large regional network of about 400 supplier and manufacturers that are vetted for wanting to engage with innovators to really curate right fit connections. So as I'm sure some of you may know or have experienced, and I'm sure we're going to get into it on the panel, it can be pretty difficult to find a startup friendly manufacturer that's willing to work in low volumes or to scale along with you. So we've learned that support on that side of things really makes a world of difference. And a quick fun fact is that there are actually 7,000 manufacturers in Massachusetts alone. So pretty crazy, and excited to connect with you all today and hopefully after the panel as well.
Very nice. Thanks, Anya. Brian, you want to jump in and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So my name is Brian. I'm an immigrant. I come from Ghana. I grew up in Nigeria. I've lived in the States since '97. Currently focused on two big things. One is raising a completely brand new fund that is a supply chain technology specialist. Our basic hypothesis is that if you think about where the world is going, the biggest problems we have to solve are fundamentally supply chain problems. And so we're raising the fund to invest in that area. The other thing that we're doing is building a grassroots-driven community. We started in New York as a New York supply chain meetup. And ultimately, because other people asked if they could create meetups of a similar kind, which would be connected to our community in New York, we decided to create what we call the Worldwide Supply Chain Federation. That between Meetup and Clubhouse, that is now at about 11,000 members around the world. And if you include all the supply chain people, my co-founder and I are connected to on LinkedIn, it comes to about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of supply chain people. So that's the perspective I'll be bringing. Before working on raising refashioned ventures. I spent 10 years building a venture fund from scratch. And it's during that time that I realized that supply chain is what I should be focused on. So.
Very nice. Thanks, Brian. And Peter, we'll kick it over to you. I think you're muted. Oh.
I didn't even remember the space bar, Brad. So I'm Peter Russo. I ran a product development company for 25 years. We created and licensed and launched hundreds of products. At the peak, I had an office in Shenzhen, China, when things were going towards China, and an office in Ohio, an office in Massachusetts. Built several companies, sold to venture, worked for venture. I have 16 patents. All of them are with products that went commercial. And about 10 years ago, I finished up and decided to go the other route and mentor people. Did a lot of work with Greentown Labs. Right now, I'm the entrepreneur in resident for Climate Tech, which is an accelerator supported by New York. That is fairly late stage, people that are going from into their manufacturing phase, mass manufacturing phase. Everyone has a pilot. So I've done the move everything to China. I also participated in the Go Back to America, Made in America program with Walmart and some other people. So I hope I can help you out.
Very nice. Thanks, Peter. And so everybody, I mean, just to sort of set the tone of who we think you are, audience, as we were told, it was broken down. It's hard to do an audience poll of raise of hands when you're virtual, as I've learned over time. But, from what I understand, we're talking to early stage founders here. 80% of this audience are you guys who are somewhere on that journey, just trying to execute against some crazy idea or vision that you have and make it a reality in the world. So we do want to speak to that. And in some ways, just sort of go through that journey and hopefully uncover some gems and some wisdom for you guys, and answer some questions, or at least make you feel it's okay. What you're experiencing is normal. So keep going and you'll get to the other side of it. So, I mean, the first area that comes to mind, and we talked about this as a panel before, is, where does it all start? And the question is, how do you gauge, like, why am I starting my company? Like, what's the first step to get to that product? Because everything kind of stems from who we are, why did we start? And, it's a broad question. And, I just want to throw it out to the panelists in terms of, how would you tell early stage founders to think about that question? And what does that really mean when you're, a product founder? Happy to kick it over to you, Peter, if you want.
Sure. I have two very different views. Recently, I've been completely mission-based. I live and breathe clean energy and automation. So one way to kick off is when you have a passion. Passion can drive everything. I spent my first 25 years, though, quite bluntly, just making money. I just wanted to make money developing product. So if you're going to do that approach, my high recommendation is focus on your customer way more than you focus on your product. In fact, we got to the point where we found customers first, found what area they wanted product in, and then developed product to meet their needs. So we had an automatic sale once we accomplished the product. So, there's a lot of ways and a lot of things that can drive you, but I suggest you think about what's going to drive you. And passion doesn't feed you as quickly, but it may last longer. But if you're going to go the other direction, know your customer. Know your customer better than you know your product at the start.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, so for the founders that are out there, how should they think about, I guess, customer discovery and getting to know their customer when you're on the passion side? There's a big problem in the world, but it's a little more difficult to discover, exactly who the customer is versus the pure capitalist money side of things. So any thoughts there?
I'll jump in quickly, and then I think Anya would be a great one for this because there's a lot of passion-driven people at Greentown. Well, so is Brian. He's driven on complete passion. I think it's just talking to people, making the connections, getting into a circle of people with the common passion, and understanding them, and seeing how close you are to a large group versus a small group, because you can also build a business being highly appreciated by a very small group. So you have a large percentage of a small group, or a very large group that you get and can attract a small percentage of them. But I'll let the others actually, everyone else is more passion-based than I am.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up just, talking to people and listening, because there's one specific anecdote that comes to mind when you ask this question. And it's just really knowing your customer base and knowing what their needs are. And I remember the Forge team had worked with a company creating appliances specifically for use in India. And this company had been working with an engineering firm, and they worked with them for about a year, and they spent so much time and money and energy, creating their initial MVP, and come to find out the hard way that the design that they had been working on for a year would not fit in an average facility in India. So, had they done that initial, discovery work and had those conversations and, been on the ground and talked to the folks in the field, they maybe would have realized that and, been able to iterate quicker. So I like that point, and I definitely agree with Peter.
Yeah, that's an anecdote that rings true to my experience as well. And I think the importance of community can't be overemphasized, because in a situation like this, the feeling I have is that what the founder knows is far less than what there is to know, because one, there's figuring out the problem, then figuring out who your customer is going to be, but then making the product and getting and fulfilling all the things that have to happen in your supply chain to get the product from where it's made to where it's ultimately going to be used. And one thing I've come to learn about product supply chains is that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And so knowing, having a community of people to whom you can quickly go to ask questions and get answers when you need those answers is essential.
Yeah, which, I mean, Brian, that's a great point and a great segue into something that we definitely wanted to touch on today, because a big question is, how does a founder know? And like, by that, I mean, not all founders have supply chain and manufacturing expertise. I would fathom a guess that probably like myself, most that start a company, especially in the passion space, aren't supply chain and manufacturing experts when they enter this arena. So, how do founders connect with that community, and then also find mentors with the knowledge to help them? Best tips and tricks there, I'm sure. Just thoughts on it. Anya, you want to kick us off, just because I'm sure you've talked to so many just recently. And
yeah, sure. So I think there's plenty of popular channels when it comes to finding a manufacturer or a supply chain partner. There's industry peers, other startups, trade shows, directories, organizations like Forge. I'd love to connect with anyone on your supply chain needs. I guess one thing I would add is that I personally wouldn't recommend Googling, as I think it can be really hard to find the right fit. And it can also be hard to tell if it's a manufacturer that's excited about, working with early stage companies or working with innovators. And that can be a really big pain point. I think another point that I would add is really just to shop around. So don't just go to one contract manufacturer and kind of settle for the lowest bidder. I think, startups, it makes sense. You often try to get your costs down right away, but sometimes going to the lowest bidder can backfire, and they might not have the ability to grow with you or the quality that you need for your product. So I would just encourage every founder to, talk to other founders, really try to develop a network and engage supply chain early, which I'm sure we'll get into as well. There's all sorts of benefits to engaging as early as possible.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess there's the vendor network to rely on, but then Brian, Peter, how should a founder think about engaging, just a mentor, an expert, somebody in the space who can offer that guidance and that help to qualify them? I know when it comes to like selecting investors, there's been millions of podcasts and books and whatnot written about like how to match with the right investor. You can check their portfolio, you can do founder references, all these other things. It's kind of a black box when it comes to how to find the right like partner within the manufacturing mentor network. So what do you guys think on that?
Yeah, I'd actually like to hear what Peter has to say, because I think he has far more experience on this. And then maybe afterwards I can chime in with an additional observation or two.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's first of all, join a group. Become a member of Greentown Labs, Mass Robotics, any one of the universities. I could kick myself because I can't remember. There's two different groups at Northeastern. Maybe when Northeastern people can jump in. Anyway, join a group that has people that come in and you get exposure to additional mentors, and they oftentimes have mentorship programs. And the mentor can help you. Here's the other thing. Once many of you will start out with a contract manufacturer who becomes your mentor. There's certain manufacturers who are willing to do that. They're giving back, or they're entertained, quite frankly, because in general, I don't want to break the news to you, but startups are horrible customers financially. The way a shop makes its money is by selling time, selling machine time. The machine actually running makes the money. Startups do everything to keep you from getting your machines running, but many of those manufacturers still love it. And Adam has a lot of events with Greentown and Forge that bring in those manufacturers, and you'll see that they love to talk to startups. Talk to a bunch of those people, and many times they will become a mentor. A mentor doesn't have to be just one person either. You can have several mentors for different types of activities and different types of advice. So join a group, talk to a lot of manufacturers, be understanding of their time and how they make money, and talk to other startup people, because other startup people will be mentors, and you'll be mentors for other startup people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Brian, not to jump ahead of you here, but I mean, Peter, it's a great point. I mean, just to share a little bit, early days Freight Farms, there weren't as many groups. I mean, Greentown Labs was being established around the time that we were being started. So, I always say I wish that was there when we were getting. There were so many things I wish that were there when we were getting started. But the communities, the groups that we were able to connect with, at Mass Challenge and Techstars and things like that, wasn't an exact fit for what we were doing, but it did plug us into a lot of people where we could then down select. The sort of follow-up question, and I'm curious, I would be curious if this is helpful to early stage founders, I hope it is, but is how to think about those different relationships in terms of mentors. Because like you said, Anya, don't always go to the lowest cost provider right out of the gate, but you're also, you're an early stage founder, every penny matters more than ever. And so, how to think about those relationships. What have you guys seen in terms of like a mentor-mentee relationship that works? Like, what's a preferred structure, and how does it change over time? And how should a founder think about that? Anya, you were nodding your head a little bit. Do you have something for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think I liked what Peter said about how sometimes your manufacturers and your suppliers can become your mentor, and whether that just be in their very specific niche. I think as a startup founder, you're probably an expert in many areas of your company, but you don't need to be an expert in every single component of your design, because you'll probably just drive yourself crazy. So I'm thinking about, if you have a discrete need for a really complex component, or you don't know the type of metal to best handle the corrosive environment that your product is going to be in, it's really important to contact the experts in those areas, who spend all day evaluating different sheet metal costs and things like that, because they're the ones really equipped to help you and help you avoid costly mistakes that you maybe otherwise wouldn't have known about. So I really agree with Peter in that the relationships don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. Your mentors can be your manufacturers, and vice versa.
I just want to make sure everyone saw the chat. Katie put in there that Northeastern has the venture mentoring network. A couple different things. So make sure you check that out. And again, just to repeat something, one of the things with the community is your fellow startup people can sometimes be your best mentors.
If I could just, sorry, can I just add in something here?
Sure.
This is Yewande Massey. I am a founder of a skincare company. So I just wanted to add, I completely agree with you, Peter, about like your mentors. Your fellow mentee, your fellow like cohorts, startup founders being mentors, because you're in the trenches together and you're going to learn a lot. And I think that's why it's important to have a really, strong network of people that are in different stages, because oftentimes they just set the path for you, and you can kind of ride those coattails in the same way you'll help other founders behind you, fix things, especially because we're just, as people in general, founders and startups, we like to like play with things and fix things and share knowledge. I mean, that's why we created these things. So I just wanted to add, thank you.
Absolutely. No, thank you. That's a fantastic point. And I would love, I would echo that. Your best support system are going to be fellow founders who, are in the trenches or have just been in a similar trench and can feel your pain. So that's fantastic. So, I mean, going into it, a question that was sent over to me before, and it's an interesting one. For startups in general, are there what are the 2 or 3 things that startups should consider when they're actually thinking about developing their supply chain for their product? Like from that, I'm not an expert, but what are the 3 things you would say? Really start thinking about these things as soon as you can, because it's going to save you in the long run. Because those are hard things to know if you're not an expert.
I can jump in really quick. I don't know
Sure.
that I have 2 or 3 right off the bat, but I think what always comes to mind when I get a question like this is, while you might be able to produce your own design in-house, you need to make sure that you're designing for manufacturing, which is an even more specific skill set that not all engineers may be familiar with. So I think an experience that I have pretty frequently is, a technical lead will come to me with a beautiful, bespoke, gorgeous design. And then, they come to find out once they've spoken with a manufacturer that if they try to manufacture something like that at scale, they won't have a business because it's just simply too complex. And so I think it's an interesting problem to have, because I think oftentimes startups don't want to hear to simplify what they're doing, but sometimes it really is the answer to making sure that you can manage your costs as you grow and scale. And one of my favorite quotes from a startup that I've worked with is from Brian Gordon at a company called Ivis. And he said, "Don't design in a vacuum." And I think that is so true. I think it's really important to just involve everyone who's going to be involved in the supply chain process as early as possible. And, recognizing that in the obviously very exciting journey of starting a company, thinking about supply chain isn't always the most glamorous part, but it's definitely one of the most important parts, especially for your runway overall. So definitely design for manufacturing.
Yeah, I think I'll add, and this is a reality I lived, a painful reality I lived. In addition for designing for manufacturing, there's, and the quote about don't design in a vacuum, I think is what the quote was, or something along those lines. Is so true, because the worst thing that could happen is that you create this beautiful product. It works in theory, and you've spent, you raised $1 million, you spent half of that $1 million creating something that works in theory, and then you go out to have conversations with potential customers, and they tell you, well, that doesn't work because it doesn't meet this very basic and fundamental need that we that we have. And then you realize that it's not going to work exactly in terms of manufacturing. and even worse because of, you know, certain nuances of design and whatnot, and the elements you want to put together, it becomes a safety risk. And so the going back to, you know, talking to as many people as you possibly can to ensure that when you decide to spend the capital that you've raised in actually getting a prototype and that sort of thing, that you're heading in the right direction. I think that's absolutely essential.
I have a lot of, I have more than three, but let me give you the top one. Let me first shock everyone by saying, throw out the idea immediately that you're shopping for price. You're a startup, do not shop for price. If you shop for price, you're shopping on spec. You don't have the knowledge to do spec. You shouldn't have the knowledge to do specification-driven purchases. You're not making a commodity. You can't compare. You'll probably actually give different scopes to different manufacturers by mistake, and you'll end up giving them something different later. So throw out the idea that you're going to get the low-cost producer. And then think about with your supplier, what do I get in addition? Because Anya was right. You'll design for manufacturing is a huge part. Design for assembly, because in many instances, your assembly costs you more money than your parts. So if you don't design it to put it together quickly, I'm working with a company right now. They have a product that has 8 layers to it. It's a filter system to create hydrogen out of food waste. And they've got to deal with Wegmans to do a pilot. They have to make the sample right now. There's 450 of these, 8 pieces. And right now they cost about $100 each because of the process to assemble. The materials cost $1.50, $2. That becomes an issue. So you have to remember that look at that manufacturer and talk to people about all those other things. Your manufacturer, when you start out, ideally would have an engineering group involved with them. Use someone who has an engineering group. So look to those other things within the supply chain that are value added, that go beyond the price of the product. Look at someone who can tell you, don't go to a manufacturer and say, Adam Rodriguez is on the phone, is on the line here. How many times do you he runs this rocket pitch session that you should all go to. And you say, oh, I want this injection molded. And you don't realize that you really could have it cast or vacuum formed when you're making 10 or 100 or even 1,000. So the manufacturing process. But if you go to an injection molder and say, I want to have this made, they're going to tell you they can make it because they can. So you need to find out about your materials, your assembly, your process. You need to find out all those things before you start thinking about buying on price, because price is based on build to print, and build to print probably doesn't happen until you've completely even prototyped and piloted your product.
So Peter, to follow up, and I'd love to get the panel's input on this. It's that gray area between you have a prototype, like you want to know exactly what your cogs are. You want to build your BOM, around exactly what goes in there, but it's going to change. So how would you advise founders to deal with that unknown, that gray area of, I've got what I think is my BOM, my cogs are okay, it's going to change, because it's your first time talking to, a contract manufacturer. Like you said, you're like, is it vacuum sealed, is injection mold? I want to talk to a few different people, BOM, cogs, before it's formed, which it's not going to be formed for a while. It's not going to be steady state for quite some time. Something I had to get comfortable with. How do you deal with that? And how should you think about your BOM and your cogs on an ongoing basis?
Because I spent the first 25 years building to make money, I'll tell you, you should, in an ideal world, you're working in reverse. What's it worth to your customer? So your minimal viable sale price. So then you're working backwards from there. What can I make, and what are the most important features? So you're identifying the order of your primary features that you have to keep in your product. And then you're talking to manufacturers, designers, and anyone who will help you to understand what are your options for making this product, what are the material options and manufacturing options. in order of those priorities of features, so that you ultimately end up with kind of a ranked list of at 10 units, at 100 units, at 1,000 units. This is the material, this is the manufacturing process, and now which one will my customer be willing to pay for? And I could go on forever, so I won't. I'll tell you this last thing, which is when you first sell your product, if you truly believe you're going to sell thousands, when you get your 100-piece price, don't buy tooling for 1,000, buy your piece for 100. And if you have to, call it a marketing cost. If you have to sell it for $20 and your cost is $25 or $30, that's okay. Sell it at $25 to see if it can really sell, using the manufacturing process that allows you to make it at 30. And then when it can sell, you can invest that big capital, that 40,000 in tooling to go injection molding, and bring your cost down to $10 and then sell it at $20.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One thing I'd add, and I think Peter touched on this, but I really want to emphasize it again based on lived experience, is to listen to the experts and specialists that you decide to engage with, right? There's no point hiring a design engineer to help you create the product, and they tell you this design you're thinking of is not gonna work. They tell you that 2 or 3 times, but being the hard-nosed, stubborn, hard-headed founder that you are, and many founders have to be hard-nosed and stubborn and hard-headed, otherwise they wouldn't succeed, right? You sort of don't pay enough attention to what they're trying to say until too many mistakes have been made. And not every engineer or other expert that you engage with is going to have the personality to butt heads with you. And so really, when it comes to the issues that Peter described, really setting aside your tendency to debate people and push back, and take in what they say and think about it and say, okay, well, what's the worst case scenario if this person is right? If this design is untenable and won't work, what does that mean? And then make decisions from that perspective. Because again, the last thing you want to happen is that, and I'll just use $1 million because it's easy to do the math. You've raised $1 million to help you get to a working prototype. You spend, $500,000, $750,000 of that $1 million, only to discover, you know what, the engineers were right. this doesn't work, and no one's going to buy it for $0, let alone $10 or $20 or whatever else I thought I'd be able to get. So that's the one nuance I'd emphasize in what Peter said.
Great. And so, I mean, just to sort of tie some of that together and a few of the things that you guys just said, don't tool for 1,000 if you only need to build 100. Don't spend $750,000 if you only got $1 million. Spend $35 to make a $25 product to get it right in the early stage. On the other side of it, and Anya, it'd be great to get your perspective, how to have those conversations, because that manufacturer oftentimes that's going to make you 25 units is very different than the one you're going to want to talk to that makes 100, makes 1,000. It might be pretty rare to find one that's chomping at the bit to do a 25 run for you that's somewhat unknown. Hopefully you can find those people who are enthusiastic about startups. But to an early stage founder, like, how do you even have that conversation? And is it a red flag if the manufacturer you're talking to says, "Oh, I love startups. Yes, we scale with you. We'll do 1, we'll do 1,000, we'll do 1 million." What are the red flags or questions to ask for a founder should ask them to determine, is this person or this manufacturer really in it with me from 25 to 100 to 1,000 or whatever they're saying? Because it's again another area of black box that if it's your first time having those conversations, where do you even start with a manufacturer that says, because like you said, Peter, you said you bring it to an injection mold guy or person. I can make it, can't tell you the speed or the cost, but I could definitely make it. how do you have that broader conversation with the manufacturer when you only want to do 25? But they, so how do you think about that? Anya, maybe you have thoughts?
Yeah, I can kick it off. And I'm glad that you brought this up because I think it's something that is a pain point for a lot of startups in just not even knowing how to have the initial conversation with a contract manufacturer. And I think what's interesting that I've learned in my year at Forge is that oftentimes the manufacturers are pretty hyper aware that this isn't going to be the biggest billing for them, at least initially. I think a lot of them do view relationships with startups as a longer term play, and them being in early on this potentially, groundbreaking, innovative company will benefit them in the long term. And I liked what Peter said also about a lot of manufacturers just like talking to startups because frankly, you're way more exciting than a lot of their other, clients. So I think it can be a difficult conversation, but I think if you find the right manufacturers, and a little biased, but you can come to Forge for help with that. You can definitely make it work. And, having a mutual understanding of, yes, it's not hundreds right now, but if this pilot is successful, then it will be, and just being really open about that. And as far as red flags, I think a lack of transparency is one that I've heard a lot. So that can really make, startups nervous. And then another thing is just if you feel like, the manufacturer is kind of trying to fit, what's that saying, like a square peg into a round hole or whatever that saying is, trying to say like, yeah, we could make your product, but you just have the sense that it's not the perfect fit. They're not the exact, they're not in the niche you're looking for. They maybe don't have the expertise you're looking for, but they could do it. I would just say keep shopping around because, there's going to be someone with more expertise in the area that you need. So don't let anyone shoehorn you into their business if it's not a good fit.
Absolutely. Brian and Peter, any additional thoughts there?
No, I think that was good. The from one side, I'll say from the startup side, do not lie. Do not lie. Don't exaggerate. Excitement is different from outright lying. Do not say I'm going to do 50,000 pieces. Please price me on 50,000 pieces if you're going to do 20. They're going to tell you the wrong manufacturer. If they're a good manufacturer, they're going to end up helping you re-engineer it to get down to a price. They're going to do a manufacturing process and so forth. So be honest. They'll be honest with you if you're honest with them. If you sandbag, they're going to sandbag. So that's number one. The second thing is do your homework and have them do their homework. Don't meet without an agenda. Don't meet without a timetable. Respect their time, make them respect your time. I shouldn't say make them respect your time. Know that they respect your time. And if they don't work with them. So be prepared and have them be prepared. Those are probably the important ones. Anya hit most of it.
Very nice. And so something that I don't think is, at least I didn't think about too much, and I definitely should have earlier on, is once the product is made, you do have to distribute and get your product to customers. A very important step. So how should founders think about, where should I manufacture? Because we've lived through like the offshoring, onshoring. Is it international versus domestic? I don't know if it seems like a debate that's always going in one way or the other, and depending on where the tides turn. So first question of probably what could be many, so I'll try to distill it down, keeping it broad, thoughts on, international versus domestic, is there, basically speak to the founders. Why would you keep it onshore? Why would you offshore it? Pretty simple, because then maybe that'll answer the question for a specific founder.
So I'll take a crack at that one. I think the way I'd look at it is what is possible where. right? There's certain things just because of globalization, the skill set to do what the founder is trying to do is not available domestically. And so don't like, I think it was Anya, or maybe it was Peter who said, don't try to shoehorn what you're doing into the business that the manufacturer is in, right? If the skill set and know-how is not ubiquitous domestically, then you probably should not make it domestically. If the best manufacturers of the product are abroad, then you should do it abroad. If on the other hand, the situation is flipped, then you should do it. Then you should do it domestically. So that's how I'd think about it. But that simplifies the issue quite a bit. And so, I think each founder then has to sit down and think, because then the other question is, okay, if the best manufacturer for this product is abroad, what does it mean if I have to deal with, and you alluded to some of the disruptions that we've had to deal with in 2020 and 2021 so far, right? Let's assume it's a black swan and that doesn't happen too frequently. I'm starting to think that we'll see more disruptions of this sort more frequently going forward. So then you have to weigh those issues as well. And that's why, having a network of people to whom you can go to and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. What do you think? What should I be thinking about, right? On the one hand, here are the pros to manufacturing abroad, and what that will do for my distribution, the challenges I'll face in terms of distribution. On the other hand, if I do it domestically, here's what that means. And it's all about trade-offs. And so that's how I think about it.
I've got some real general rules of thumb, and keeping in mind that I've made a lot of product here and I had an office in China. So the number one thing is, can you communicate? If you can't communicate with your vendor, I don't care whether they're here or there, if you don't have a good communication method, if you're not willing to work their hours, don't have them work your hours. So if you're not willing to have a 12-hour difference in timing, and start talking to people at 10 o'clock at night or 1 in the morning, it's tough to do business in China unless you hire an agent, and then you're one step away. If your product is going to evolve, it's always better I like the US better. You can go travel to see your vendor, you can talk to them. If something has to evolve, you can be there while it evolves. You get to experience the changes. If it's out of sight, even if it was across the country. If you're in Massachusetts, try to find someone in Massachusetts. If you're someplace else, try to find them locally, because you don't get to experience that change. They could change the assembly process and you wouldn't even know it. There's print and then there's know-how. And what know-how is, and it's, if you have a complicated product and you're patenting it, clean energy is a great example. A lot of times, how they handle the machine in the factory is actually more valuable proprietary information than your actual patent. The speed they run the machine, the type of machine they run, how they coat whatever you're coating, and all of that. So if that's local, you visit it regularly. If it's not, then you're going to be going to China 4 times a year minimum. So keep that in mind. If you're building to print, however, if you've established and it's completely done and it has heavy labor, you're not going to be able to make it in the US as inexpensively or competitively as you can in China. So once you're built, if you had a small electronic, if you're doing a Fitbit and you've mastered it, you know what you want it to be, and the design is set and you're building to print, you have to go to India or China to build it competitively. And it's safe to do that because you're building to print. So that's a couple things to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think to Peter's point, in my experience with startups, a lot of time it is really a matter of volumes. And I actually think we have a piece on the Forge blog. If someone on the Forge team can pop that into the chat for some more context. But I won't linger too much because I think a lot of you probably saw this coming, that Forge is a big advocate for domestic production and particularly local and regional production. And we really believe that if you can invent it locally, you should be empowered to make it locally. And there's actually a lot of unique competitive advantages to doing so. So Peter mentioned a few of them, but just recognizing that international outsourcing may appear cheaper on paper, but local production usually means streamlining the product development process, more straightforward ways to handle IP, elimination of long lead times and supply chain disruptions, getting rid of the risk of unexpected tariffs. That's a big one a lot of people don't think about. A reduction in your carbon footprint, especially if you are a climate and impact oriented organization. So I think there's a lot of things that maybe don't come up initially for people, but if you start to think about all of the costs involved, it's definitely worth considering working locally. And if that's something you're interested in, we'd love to help you do that. We're not going to push any startup to work locally if it doesn't make sense for them, but if it's something you're interested in, I'm happy to chat offline.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna pretty much echo what everyone said, just from personal experience. I mean, as a founder, to be very hands-on with the product, hands-on with your changes in real time, like Peter said, like Anya said, if you can visit and it's a 20-minute drive to get to your manufacturer, you're in real time with the rest of your team, iterating. Those that are yourself talking to customers that are in the product, on the product, can then be there with your manufacturer who can also help you. So it just makes the whole process. And I mean, something we experienced, I experienced directly, is that lead time. If you're still in a rapid iteration phase, or not even a rapid iteration phase, but if you're gonna make changes, I think, Peter, to your point, like almost at all, like sending it out, having a sample run done, et cetera, and you have 6 weeks for it to come back. Then you do work changes, and it's then 6 weeks to get it stood up, and then you're talking months before what should be a simple iteration gets changed. So I always liked having manufacturing as close as possible. And it also just makes you feel more in touch with the product, which also leads to customers.
Let me add one thing that piggybacks on what you just said, Brad. No matter where you have it made, own it. A lot of times people will say, "Oh, I'm going to go to China because they're going to pay for the tooling, or they're going to build the tooling into the cost of my product," and no one in the U.S. will do that. Be really careful, because when you then want to make a change, so they make the tooling, and you said you're thinking you're going to do 20,000 pieces, and you make 3,000 pieces, and there's an issue or an opportunity, and the customer wants something, and you say, "Oh, I need to change my tooling," and the plant says, "Well, they either say or they just stall because they don't." They own that tooling. They just spent the money that you said you didn't want to spend on the tooling, so they don't want to make the change. So wherever you go, and don't get tricked into going overseas because you think your startup costs are much less, especially if it's tooling or fixtures. First of all, fixtures should be done where the parts being assembled or made, but and fixtures are something that holds things in place while you get it assembled and so forth. You have them made locally and so forth. But tools that are expensive, injection molding tools, vacuum forming tools, so forth. If you need to, you can have it made in China and and managed by an American manufacturer who's going to take it back and use that tool if you want to do that. Although there's more and more often now, there's what's called soft tooling. It means it's made out of a softer material, so it doesn't last for as many runs. But there's lots of ways to stay here from the start that don't get lulled into thinking, "Wow, it's so much cheaper. The starting dollars are cheaper there." Not necessarily true.
Right. And so, I mean, I have a couple questions that I'll let you guys think on a little bit. One is, just book recommendations for founders. I don't know, just anything you guys would suggest people read. The other one that I just thought of, which I'll give everybody a minute before we go into breakout groups in a little bit to think on, is, a product for founders to look at that is a good example of it started, it scaled up, it went through the trials and tribulations, because the internet's a beautiful thing for that, where you can look it up and look at the iterations of this product, of where it started and sort of, that trend now of where it started, where it is now, et cetera, showing my social media age there for a second. But the real question is, it's a little bit broad, but you alluded to it, Peter. Early days, dollars are tight. You don't want to, you don't want to overpay for anything. You don't want to spend $750K on something that ends up being useless. Brian, to your point, where should you spend the money? Like, you're a founder. Let's say you've got $100,000. You don't have $1 million. Like, and you're at prototype that you've built by hand. It's cobbled together with duct tape and bubble gum. Where do you spend the money? What's the priority? Sorry, I laid like 3 questions right on you. So.
I can start with the book question.
Great.
This is actually a book that the Forge and I think the Greentown team has everyone that comes on board read. It's called Disciplined Entrepreneurship by Bill Ollett. So it's a 24-step framework to startup success generally that is highly recommended. And to your point of kind of a startup example of where were they and where are they now? I think one that always comes to mind for me is called BioBot. So I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with them, but they are a startup that Forge worked with a couple years ago back in the day. And they were making robots that would climb into wastewater treatment and collect data on various different community health issues. So at the time, I believe they were targeting the opioid crisis. And so they were able to evaluate, the effects of the opioid crisis in different communities because that's often a pretty silent issue. And they've recently, come to great success because they were actually able to pivot and address COVID-19 in communities and do that tracking. And I believe they're now deployed in 42 states or something like that. So that's been an awesome example of kind of a look where they are now story, and really the value in pivoting when you see an opportunity. I had this quote for an event that I attended, and it wasn't who's Mr. Right, but who's Mr. Right now, as far as your target market fit and everything. So I think that's a really fun example.
That's great. Brian, Peter?
I'll take the book one. I think in terms of just coming to grips with the complexities of supply chains in general, a supply chain for dummies is a good place. It's a good place to start, right? It explains the ideas and the concepts in very simple language. And I tend to like to think of supply chain and operations as different sides of the same coin, right? So your supply chain is the operations related to creating your products that extend outside your own company or organization. And operations is what you do within your own company or startup. And so I'd also say, operations management for dummies is probably a good companion to supply chain management for dummies.
And I would also suggest looking at just Google memory joggers. They're all little, very small reference manuals that you can look things up quickly when a manufacturer or supply chain person's talking to you and you say, I don't know what that is. You should, first of all, don't be afraid to stop someone and ask them what something is, but there's a whole series of them. There's eliminating waste through your company. There's, I'm reading it over here, meet supply side. There's Lean Six Sigma. There's a lot of really quick reference. It's not inspirational. This is I need to look something up, and it's a whopping 100 pages long and literally 3 inches wide and 6 inches tall. I love them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's a great. I mean, a book that kind of jumped, and it's not inspirational either, but something that I always would reference from time to time is the McMaster car catalog. I would use it mostly when we were getting stuck in that space of we're spinning on designs and then being like, well, nobody makes something that looks and acts just like that or does that exact thing. And then I go in my McMaster car catalog that is thud worthy. You need a hefty table to hold it and thumb through there. And sometimes, I mean, you got to set aside a few minutes and also try and stay focused if you have a little bit of attention issues like I do. But almost every time can find something and say, oh, why are we designing that specific connection or that piece? there's manufactured pieces, and it also inspires thought around all these things that we don't need to be designing that are going to go into the product. So that was a book I always like to have on my desk.
Brad, they have a wonderful website now.
I know, but it felt so good to get lost in it. Like you could just search on the website, and it almost felt too easy. Which again, it's the physical nature, I guess, of me. I don't like a lot of books in the area, but that one I always like to have around. It made me feel comfortable. I don't know why. Probably shared a little too much for this panel today. Yeah, so I think Katie was going to jump on. Oh, there she is. She just came on video to sort of direct traffic, because I realized we're coming up on the 5 o'clock hour here.
Absolutely, perfect timing. We want to thank you all for this panel discussion today. I'm actually going to have us head straight into breakout rooms here, as opposed to field a couple of questions from the chat. We had a couple of great questions in the chat, and I'd love for those who posted those questions, Yawande, Kyle, to get in breakout rooms with our panelists and ask those questions live. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and stop the recording here today, and Wendy is going to open up breakout rooms.